The Great Migration, focusing on the experiences of Black women. What the Great Migration was the immigration between the 1910s and the 1970s of over 7 million Black people from the South to the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. The first Great Migration, the one we're sort of focusing on here, is the movement of people between 1916 and 1921. And this is really pushed by World War I and directed towards the Northeast and the Midwest. Basically the cities, the big urban cities that were on the train lines from the South. Over that period of time, it was estimated that about 500,000 Black people traveled north, and that was about 5% of the total population of African Americans in the South. So a lot of people. Up to half of all female African American travelers in the Great Migration, First Great Migration, had no spouse or were not traveling with their spouse. What were they trying to leave behind? Black girls in particular. There were 3 particular things that they were fleeing. One was a lack of educational opportunity. Girls had to go to work at very early ages, leaving them little time for education. And of course, they were facing a very poor education system for African Americans. Secondly, there was a desire to find new kinds of work, something beyond domestic work or sharecropping, some new opportunity. And then thirdly, there was a fear of the system of racial and sexual violence that was such a part of Southern culture. World War I was an opportunity for everybody to move up a notch. What it meant for Black women was that white women were leaving domestic jobs, other kinds of hard physical labor, to do work for the military producing companies, which were better jobs, better paying, all the rest of it. That meant that they left jobs behind that Black women could now apply for and get. Black women were not getting the best jobs out there, but they were getting better jobs than they had had before. The problem is that this is fleeting. It only lasts for the period of war. When the war is over, that's the end of it. And as one magazine explained in 1919, war expediency opened the door of industry for African American women, but that in most cases, the colored woman is the marginal worker. She is the last one to be hired, and she is the first one to go. What African Americans found when they reached northern cities is that they were facing de facto segregation. That means that there wasn't a law saying that Black people lived here, white people lived there. There was simply custom. Realtors would only show Black people apartments or homes in Black neighborhoods. In the rare case when somebody would allow someone to rent or buy in a white neighborhood, then the neighbors often took action, various methods of harassment and violence to drive the Black person Black family out of that neighborhood. It also becomes quickly true that Black neighborhoods were vice zones. In other words, practices like prostitution, gambling were allowed to exist in Black neighborhoods and were not stopped by the police in the way they were in other white neighborhoods. And finally, of course, African Americans were always the minority population, less than 9% of the population of any given city, and less than 2% of the total population of the North. There was a tension in between the old settlers, the Black people who had been here before the Great Migration, and the new people who were just arriving from the South. And frequently, the old settlers believed that they themselves were much more respectable, knew how to behave, knew how to act. They tended to see the new visitors, the new people coming from the South, as much less respectable. They wore bright colors. They had worship services that were much more emotional and demonstrative. They were attracted to the various places where you could go and listen to jazz and blues being played, which was regarded as an irrespectable kind of music, a dangerous kind of music. So they generally looked at them as a problem. What this meant for black girls is there was a particular concern for black girls, the idea that they needed to be guided to not fall into the traps of sexuality and wild conduct. And in fact, the old settlers did try to create a number of uplift services to try to protect and help the new people from the South. So, for example, here we have the Chicago League on Urban Conditions Among Negroes trying to offer helping services. And there were a number of services that were put together specifically to help black girls. And in fact, for many of the people, the old settlers, and also for a lot of white people looking at the black community, black girls were seen as a central part of the problem. They were all too often seen as being, quote, Jezebels, sexually active, promiscuous, going to listen to jazz and blues, wild and crazy, dressing in bright colors, speaking loudly, not being well-mannered, chewing gum, all of these various stereotypes. At the same time, there was a real reluctance among people to treat black girls as children or young women in need of protection. And that becomes one of the things that the old settlers, while they're uncomfortable with a lot of the behavior of the migrants from the South, at the same time, they want to see the girls to be treated as someone who needs to be protected rather than an adult woman who is not in need of concern from others. The lack of protection for black girls played out in a lot of ways. One, for example, was because there were very few foster homes or orphanage care for black girls, they often ended up, if there was an issue, being placed in juvenile detention homes. So a girl who was being removed from her home due to, let's say, a problem of incest, so she's a victim of sexual abuse, might then herself end up in a juvenile detention home because there is, quote, no other place to put her. For black parents and many black young women and girls, having the opportunity to go to school was one of the great advantages of moving north. And they took advantage of that. By 1920, 90% of black children were attending school. So, I mean, it's definitely something that the black community considered a major part of the incentive of being in the North. Unfortunately, they found that their schools in the black neighborhoods were often poorly equipped, older, and overcrowded compared to schools in white neighborhoods. One of the issues that came up was that children from the Deep South could find themselves isolated because they were seen as speaking the wrong way, dressing wrong, not knowing the proper habits and behaviors that were expected of children in school. So it could be an opportunity, but it could also be a situation of isolation. It was also a problem because black girls, and there's a whole thing about this with black boys, but we're not talking about that today. For black girls, there was a tendency for them to end up under discipline in schools. There was, for example, things like talking, impudence, but also black girls got into trouble because they were seen as behaving too freely with boys. Charlestoning, in other words, dancing. And there was a whole bunch of concern about how black girls played with boys or acted with boys that could result in them being put in discipline, because the fear is always this is the first step towards them becoming fallen women. And of course, part of these problems come from simply issues of poverty. So you have girls who are cited for stealing apples from the lunchroom, or inadequate clothing, or an unclean personal appearance, and that's probably just that they were poor. On the other hand, there are things that are clearly that division about respectability and proper behavior, because the girls get in trouble for powdering their noses, painting their lips, and combing hair in class, or refusing to remove hair ornaments, wearing earrings. And then finally, there was the issue of duty. For girls, sometimes they could have these opportunities to go to school, and that could be seen as interfering with their duties towards their family. That the time they want to spend at school is time that their families might see as better devoted towards doing work, caring for children in the home, household duties. So they had to sort of balance between what they wanted and what their family needed from them. And of course, people faced the problems of poverty. One of the basic problems, of course, is that if you're poor, you can't buy in bulk. You have to buy a little bit at the time. And by doing that, you end up paying more for whatever you're buying. In addition to that, they had to shop at the local shops. The local shops usually had higher prices than shops in white neighborhoods, because they knew that the local residents didn't have anywhere else to go. Further, they faced the problem that because African Americans were confined to certain neighborhoods, they had to pay higher rents, and most of their income went to pay the rent that it took to give them a place to live. The poorest families had to live pretty much on credit to try to keep their families fed. In addition to that, families in the North no longer had access to some of the things they could have used down South to help keep their family fed, like a garden, like cows, hogs, various things as a backup to what they were able to buy for food. That was no longer available. In addition to that, there's now the need for warm clothes, warm shoes, other kinds of necessities for life in the urban North. One additional issue was that about 1/3 in one study of black homes took in lodgers as a way of getting some additional money, so a single person would live in the household. This brought in additional money, but it increased the workload on the woman of the house, who was expected to keep the lodger fed, look after their clothes, and provide for them. In addition to that, there are frequent references in social work records by girls the sexual abuse by male lodgers in their households as a fairly common thing to happen. What cities did offer was entertainment, everything from movies to bars, to dance halls, to pool halls. All of these were out there and available to young people in particular. And for young women, they took advantage of that, particularly the time that they had to do these kinds of entertainments in that brief period before they got married and had children. They took advantage of all the entertainment they could find. Unlike in the South, where girls were expected to turn over all of their wages to their parents, girls in the North were more likely to keep their wages and spend them. Where little girls or younger girls might buy coloring books and dolls, older girls spent their money on clothes, makeup, records, magazines, movies, other kinds of entertainment. And that was something that drove their parents crazy because many of them didn't want their girls going out. They didn't want them spending their money. They didn't want them going out to these places. They didn't saw them as at risk from the city. For a lot of older women, the place they turned to was black churches. And a lot of these churches were pretty minimal, what they call storefront churches. But they were a place to go and worship. They were a place to find relief. As one woman explained, we were living in apartments and in little short streets and things like that. Back then, you didn't have a whole lot to look forward to. People were so religious like that because all their hope was in the Lord. That's how it was. So this became a place to go for community and worship and spiritual elevation. There were even a few churches, not many, but a few, that had black female preachers. Conclusions? There were some opportunities in the North. Opportunities for entertainment, opportunities for certain kinds of jobs. But for black women, a lot of those opportunities fell through. And moreover, African American people found in the North that racism continued to dictate a lot of the conditions of their lives. They also found it very hard to break away from the poverty they had come north to escape.